Good evening from Beijing and welcome to this special edition of Climate Talk. Climate change is one of the defining challenges of our time. To tackle this, a global coordinated effort is needed from not only politicians but also economic and civil leaders. Dozens of global leaders attended a virtual climate summit on April 22nd, and during the meeting, they laid out their ambitious goals. But achievements of these goals are largely dependent on the commitment from policymakers and detailed action plans based on careful feasibility studies across multiple industries. There are uncertainties ahead, but in order to control climate change, carbon emissions have to drop to zero from 51 billion tons annually. We will need to restructure our way of living around this goal over the next decade. Innovation, capital, government policies, and aid to developing countries are all essential. Our discussion today will focus on the opportunity and challenges from an investment perspective and try to find some answers to tackle this complicated problem. We're very honored to have the three guests joining me from China and the United States today. Nathaniel Keohane is the Senior Vice President of Environmental Defense Fund, joining us from New York. And Nate testified in Congress earlier this year on climate subjects. And he was a longtime advisor to the Obama government. In studio in Beijing with me today is Mr. Erfei Liu, CEO of Asia Investment Fund. Erfei Liu is a well-known global financier and has held various advisory roles in the Chinese government. And Professor Xu Jintao is from Peking University, National School of Development. He is an expert in climate and has various publications specializing in the climate sector. So gentlemen, welcome, and I look forward to a candid discussion today. Let me start from you, Nate. If you look at the track record of the United States government on climate, flip-flops have happened during several administrations, from George W. Bush to Trump and to today's Biden government. In the April 22nd summit, Biden laid out a very, very aggressive plan saying that you are going to halve your 2005 carbon emission by 2030. How should we trust him this time?
Well, it is true. And well, first of all, thank you for having me on the program. And I'm really looking forward to this discussion with such distinguished colleagues. So you've asked an important question because the United States does have a mixed record. As you say, President Clinton in the 90s was quite strong on this. Actually, even before him, President George H.W. Bush signed a document in Rio that became the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. But since Clinton, it has gone back and forth. George W. Bush pulled the U.S. out of Kyoto. Barack Obama was very forward-leaning on climate. And of course, Donald Trump pulled the U.S. out of Paris. And so it's understandable that the rest of the world is saying to the U.S., you've got to show that you're really committed this time. And in the U.S., there is a lot of thinking about how to make policy really durable. Right. President Biden did put a very ambitious target on the table last week. We've seen a real whole of government approach from this U.S. administration, but we'll need to keep seeing that, and we'll need to keep seeing climate change being a central motivating issue in pretty much everything that this administration does. And I think that will be key to regaining some of that credibility that the U.S. needs to restore its leadership.
Right. Having said that, what you just mentioned is mostly top-down approach. Any bottom-up, detailed roadmap to reach such goal?
Yes, well, so this goal was a very high-level goal of reducing emissions, as you say, 50 to 52% below 2005 levels across the economy by 2030. So at the moment, all that President Biden was announcing was that top-level goal. But there have been a number of analyses and modeling studies, as you referred to in your introduction, that show the math of how to achieve that goal. And we know it's going to require major changes across the economy. I'm sure we'll get to this in the conversation. Power, transport, methane from oil and gas, agriculture, those will be some of the keys. So while the goal itself at this point is quite high level, there has been a huge amount of work done inside the administration and in places like Environmental Defense Fund to show the underlying modeling and analysis that demonstrates how that goal can be achieved.
Right. Okay. So, gentlemen here in the studio, same question to China. We also had our huge commitment this time during the Global Leaders Summit. So, do you think it's achievable? Professor Xu, let's start from you.
We made a commitment in Paris.
Right.
And led by President Xi Jinping last year, made a new commitment, and it's a huge improvement from the previous commitment. And we're going to reach the peak of carbon emission before 2030, and carbon neutral in around mid-century or 2060. So it's a much stronger commitment, and it means a lot of change in our economy.
Right. So, we will get into the detailed plan of China's roadmap to reach that carbon neutrality later. But Erfei, let me ask you one question. China is global manufacturing center, and we produce a lot of stuff that consumed by developed countries. Is it fair to put all those carbon emission quotas onto China, so to speak, because we produce things for others to consume? Shouldn't developed countries also share part of that?
I think this is a global issue that requires global action.
Right.
I think this is a complex issue. Historically, the developed countries, they polluted and they clean up, and now they are saying let's share the burdens equally.
Right.
The developing countries, of course, we want to be able to pollute and clean up as well, and then the counter argument is that the climate change is such an urgent issue. We can't afford to have every country to pollute and clean up.
Right.
So that will require some political compromise on all sides. And I think China is already taking a lot of action in this regard. I think that the China and U.S. any actions without China or the United States is going to be a waste of time.
Well, exactly,
so
because we are the number one and number two.
Right, and per capita we are still far behind the United States. On a total basis, we emit more carbon, much more, almost double the United States now.
Right. So, Nate, Erfei just mentioned a very important word, per capita, because if you look at the per capita emission from 1950, which is supposed to be right post the industrial level, to today, there's no way for China to meet that per capita emission that the United States has emitted. So, from per capita perspective, it's definitely not fair. But to address this global issue, it is important for these two countries to work together as a coordinated effort to combat this climate change. Bill Gates, in his new book, mentioned a word called a green premium. This is basically a concept that you have to pay extra when you buy products produced by those renewable new energies because they're more expensive. In order to flatten this green premium, what should we do, and what kind of innovation and capital support we need from the U.S. side? What's your observation?
Sure. Well, I think there's a lot of important points there. Let me pick out that idea of the green premium and say something about that, and then move on to the question of innovation, which is really critical.
Right.
I think Bill Gates has written a terrific book, and I think the concept of a green premium is the right one. As someone trained as an economist, I'd rather think about that actually as really having prices in our economy reflect the costs of pollution and the damages from pollution when we burn fossil fuels or other things. So rather than thinking about, we have to compensate for green products to be more because they're more expensive. Right. Rather, we should be understanding that unless we have policies in place, the cost that the consumer sees, the prices the consumer sees of a range of goods don't actually reflect the damage and the real social cost that's being done by the pollution. This is a very old idea in economics. It goes back over a century, and it's very clear that the way to address that is to have policies in place that put a price on carbon pollution. Now, here's something really interesting. China is actually quite well ahead of the U.S. at a federal level in having that sort of system. Right. One way to do that is an emissions trading program. We can talk more about that later, but China has this now for its national power sector. That's very important, a very important step forward. And in the U.S., we're making progress at the state level, but not yet at the federal level. So getting those prices right is going to be important. And that connects to this investment point, because ultimately, I think about two ways to drive investment briefly. One is getting those prices right in the market, as I just referred, because that will give investors the right signals where they should put their dollars or their RMB. Right. The other point is really helping to push innovation and R&D through government funding for research. And that's also going to be very important. So those are the sort of two prongs of policy for pushing innovation.
Right. I think that's insightful. So in terms of to facilitate innovation, one thing is very critical, which is the capital. If there's no capital, innovation cannot be put into the real production level, so to speak. However, what we have been seeing from 2015, what happened is that after the first wave of investment into the renewable energy, a lot of private capital exited from the market because the return cannot be justified. Will this time be different? Erfei, can you just address this question first, and then we can go back to Nate?
Yeah, I think Nate and Professor Xu, they've talked about this from from top down, right? Government policies, regulations. Well, what we are seeing, we are a private equity fund.
Right.
We've voluntarily hold ourselves to high ESG standards, and we would like to invest only in green companies, right? What we are seeing is some companies, being green is already a competitive edge because it requires innovation, it build up competitive edge that has very defensible marketplace. They are able to do so because their customers demand your product to be green. If your customers demand your product green because they can sell to their customers at a premium. So the key is to build up this momentum of ecosystems where everybody from the government to the consumers to companies, they all want to be green. So over time will snowball into a big momentum.
So that really requires a collective effort from both enterprises who drives innovation, private equity funds who drives the funding, and also government regulation level, and also very importantly market acceptance out of that. So Professor Xu, what if other developing countries, they cannot afford or they don't really have such kind of green innovation technology, so they cannot do those kind of green products production, hence they will further lose their market and lose their competitiveness in this new revolution, this round of new green revolution. What are they going to do? For instance, India.
I don't really have a good answer to that. But I traveled to several developing countries, and for example, India. India has been pretty active in several areas, and even ahead of China, like market-based instrument for renewable energies. India adopted auctioning scheme to support to facilitate competition in renewable energy market. We turned our feed-in tariff policy to auctioning scheme 2 years ago, and I think this scheme is very important for both countries to speed up cost reduction and productivity growth in renewable energy section. So there are good experiences, good examples in other large developing countries.
So you actually mentioned a very critical point, is that developing countries are also trying to catch up in terms of innovation and also their own revolution to embrace a green and better eco-friendly world. So Nate, in the meantime, don't you think United States should aid more as a developed country in terms of helping those developing countries are less equipped with technology and innovation?
Yes, I was just going to say that point where, and I think actually there's a role for China here too, through the Belt and Road Initiative. So let me take the U.S. first. I do think the U.S. should be doing much more to promote, to essentially provide climate finance overseas to developing countries. That's something that has multiple benefits for the U.S. It helps those countries, those developing countries, reduce their own emissions, helps them be more resilient to the climate change that is already happening, because we need to recognize that climate change is happening already and will continue to happen. But at the same time, it can also help create markets, not only to spur the markets and the economic growth of those developing countries, but because it's not a zero-sum game, it can also help spur and create markets for U.S. products and U.S. exports. It's a classic win-win. And so I do think the United States has a moral responsibility, but also an economic benefit from providing more aid in climate finance to developing countries to help them deploy those newer low carbon innovations and low carbon technologies. And that is something that President Biden has put into his budget. He mentioned in last week's summit a new commitment for international climate finance. I will say briefly, I think China, with its enormous Belt and Road Initiative, also has an opportunity here as well to help provide infrastructure financing and help developing countries and other countries in the emerging economies in the Belt and Road to make those investments. And we've heard President Xi say he will promote efforts towards a greener BRI, which I think is really critical. And so if you can have those two countries, which are not only the two biggest emitters in the world, the two largest economies in the world, both using some of their kind of economic might to promote green investment and innovation in other countries around the world, I think that both helps in the climate fight, but also helps the economies of China and the U.S. As they have new markets to grow into.
Right. You mentioned a very important aspect, which is the budget. We all understand in order to reach the carbon peak and carbon neutrality, huge investments will be needed. So what is the funding gap right now for China? Let's just say 2030 first, Professor Xu.
I think we have a lot of funding. So, government has put out an ambitious stimulus program again recently. So the key is to be very careful of where the money goes.
Right.
And we have lessons in the 11th five-year plan period. So most of the funding went to high carbon industry.
Right.
And that should be avoided this time around. And I think the central government noticed the problem of this trend, and there are several. Our president even emphasized in the recent speech that the 14th five-year plan period should be a period of reforming China's energy system, making it a renewable energy focused system.
Right.
I think that's critical.
Right. So according to a recent report released by Sequoia China, I read the funding gap to 2030 is about 3 trillion RMB. So Erfei, how much do you think will be coming from the government side and how much will be funded by private equity or private funding?
I don't have a macro view of what's needed. But we find that there are no shortage of opportunities where it is good policy as well as good businesses. So we'll focus on investing in opportunities where it is profitable to be green. And there are a lot of that. I think if everybody on a grassroots level, from bottom up, start to do that, and the consumers build into their consciousness that it's good to be green, and they will pay the green premium that you urged earlier. So you can do well and you can do good, and it's pretty soon will become a momentum that feeds upon itself. So that's how I think about the issue.
Right, market will respond to that as well. So Nate, in terms of government infrastructure, China is relatively advanced in terms of infrastructure construction compared to the U.S. But in this round of green revolution, what do you think the role the U.S. government will play to set up all these infrastructure needed for the green age?
Well, it's at the center of policy debates in the United States now, as you may know. The president has put forward what he calls his American Jobs Plan, which is an infrastructure package. Congress is considering, the U.S. Congress is considering legislation to make significant, massive investments in infrastructure. And the reason is, and I think it's similar to the economic conditions we just heard about in China, or the thinking about stimulus, right? Coming out of the deep recession from the COVID-19 crisis, the U.S. is in a position where, first of all, policymakers want to provide some of that economic stimulus. Second, there's a real need to address the infrastructure in the U.S., much of which is now decades old. And third, there's an opportunity to use that and use this moment to make significant investments toward a low carbon transition. So President Biden has made climate and clean energy central to his over $2 trillion infrastructure package and proposal for the U.S. That would include things like vehicle electrification, charging infrastructure. It would include mass transit and rail to modernize and upgrade rail. It would include modernizing the U.S. electric grid, investments in energy efficiency, and so on. So that infrastructure package that President Biden has proposed really puts climate and clean energy at the heart of it. And I think we'll see the same thing in what Congress passes later this summer. The Democrats have enough votes in the U.S. Congress to pass something that just involves budget and infrastructure. And I think that's what we'll see probably by July or August.
Right. So that's encouraging news for this global climate challenge. In terms of the renewable energy or the clean energy, one of the biggest issue is the reliability and the stability, especially during the transition. So Erfei, from investment perspective, do you see Chinese companies or global companies are starting to tackle this problem from their innovations?
Yes, I think at this point in time, China is focusing on hydro.
Right.
I think hydro is reliable, mostly reliable, although sometimes it's seasonal.
Right.
I think solar and wind is still a work in progress. I think that will take some time. But just to give you a sense, I think people start to wake up to the reality that climate change is really a very urgent issue.
Right.
It's what they call clear and present danger. 5 years ago, my daughter would tell me, it's like, she's an environmentalist, and she said, keep saying to me that climate change is the most important issue. I keep saying, well, why is that important? Maybe it's just natural cycle. And, and then I told my daughter I'm going to get on a program about climate change. She said, no, I told you so. And she said, you finally have come around.
Right.
I think that there are quite a few people, around me that are starting to feel that way. I think enough people around us feel that way, then we can spread the news and spread the message that climate change is the most important issue. Then we can reflect that in our actions.
Right.
We'll pay a green premium. we can invest in green companies, and we play in the stock market. We focus on those, and that will help build momentum and to give profit-driven private companies, private PE companies, and give them incentive to invest, and government will have an easier job.
Right.
So that's the message I'm trying to deliver today.
Right. To create a virtuous cycle.
Yeah.
So Professor Xu, Erfei mentioned that hydro is still the focus in terms of renewable energy in China, clean energy in China. Why not nuclear?
I don't know much about nuclear.
Right.
But it seems that in the world, in nuclear, the interest in nuclear is declining, and especially with the Japanese incidents, the people are taking even more cautious on nuclear development. I don't have a special opinion about it. I'm not an expert, but renewable energy still has a huge potential to grow.
So Nate, is the same view towards nuclear energy in the States right now? Because from the materials that I read and the documents that I read, nuclear energy is supposed to be one of the most efficient clean energy now. Are you still having the same concern with what Professor Xu just addressed?
Well, I guess when we think about nuclear power, at least from Environmental Defense Fund's perspective, we distinguish between the existing nuclear fleet and new nuclear. So in the U.S., nuclear power is about 20% of the current electric generation mix. And we think it's quite important to maintain that. Some of those nuclear plants are coming to the end of their original permitting. They're still safe. They're still functioning. We think they should be continued because it's going to be critical if we're going to make the reductions we need to meet President Biden's goal we were talking about at the beginning. We need to continue having that zero carbon power that already exists.
Right.
Having said that, at least in the United States, new nuclear plants have proven to be too expensive. They're just much more expensive to build in the U.S. than wind or solar, even if you factor in battery storage and other things to get that reliability. Now, there is another new wave coming of innovative nuclear technologies. We were talking earlier about innovation. Well, this is one of the potentially most important areas of innovation and research and development.
Right.
So there are a number of startup companies that think they have new modular approaches or smaller nuclear reactors, perhaps could be less expensive, safer, easier to contain. So I think it's worth doing research into that. And this is a big area of research and R&D for the United States, because we will need some form of 24/7, always on, zero carbon power. And we don't want to be stuck picking one or the other option right now. We should be investing in a portfolio, as Erfei might say, as government should be investing in a portfolio of alternatives so that we're sure that we're going to get some innovations coming through. So I would say new advanced nuclear, as it's called, should be a focus for government R&D and innovation. But in the near term, we can greatly expand wind and solar power, certainly in the U.S., and really cut emissions from the power sector just with those existing renewable technologies. So it's more of a next generation thing rather than something we need in this decade.
Right. You mentioned the solar power, and also you mentioned other renewable energy and clean energy. But we understand there are certain geographic areas can produce all these clean tech, while certain geographic areas, they don't really have that kind of natural environment, natural condition. So Professor Xu, how do you think this will reallocate our employment opportunities in China, as well as impact economic development regionally?
Yes, it's true that renewable energy has some geographical bias in China. China is a large country. But from our recent study, I think the problem with the further development of renewable energy really is the local market obstacles, or fragmentation of market.
Right.
When we talk about energy sector reform, people believe that it's the problem is a monopoly of state grid.
Right.
When you do field study, really, the problem is a localized market. And the state grid actually has not enough power to coordinate national market. I think to facilitate renewable energy development and even stabilizing renewable the fluctuation problem of renewable energy, we need a integrated market, nationwide integrated market. So the stability will improve.
Right.
And and the other more flexible power sector ability, like household-based solar generation.
Right.
So it's a flexible energy system. That's what we needed to facilitate renewable energy.
Right. Well, do you think it is possible for China to actually integrate this part of construction and to integrate the market mechanism, at least from the very beginning, to facilitate the market growth?
The idea of having a state grid is just for that, but we have problem to overcome. There are local interests, and we already have a NDRC policy against local market, localized market control. So I think we have to do that. We have to have a nationwide integrated power market.
Yeah, but we did better on the carbon pricing trading side. So Nate, what's your take on that? On the U.S. side, do you also see this localization problem vis-a-vis a national interest? And in terms of the carbon pricing, China just launched its national carbon trading board, while U.S. understand it's still concentrated in each state. So tell us the situation from your side.
Yeah. I was just going to say, it's very interesting to hear Professor Xi talk about this, because it's a very similar structure in the U.S. in terms of the power sector. I think in both countries, obviously for different historical reasons, but you have a quite localized power sector structure. So for the electric power market in the U.S., that's generally controlled by states. There is some interconnection among the states, but there are some states, like the state of Texas in the U.S., which are actually largely walled off and not connected to other states. And in fact, we saw just a few months ago, there was a freak polar vortex incident where temperatures dipped in Texas became much colder than usual. And the electric system went into crisis because natural gas lines froze and so on. So the US also has this problem of too much of a local market, and also has challenges at the federal level in terms of building the kind of long distance transmission lines that would link up, let's say, very sunny places in the southwest of the United States with population centers. So I just wanted to note, in both cases, we're talking about very large area, very large countries, obviously China larger than the US, but both very large geographical areas where there's a need, if we're really going to take advantage of wind and solar, to integrate those markets over longer distances so that we can take advantage of solar power and wind power where it is and bring it to population centers. So I just thought that was an interesting parallel. Briefly, in terms of the carbon pricing and the emissions trading, this really is an area where China has taken leaps and bounds recently. And Environmental Defense Fund has an office in Beijing, and my colleagues there have been working on this program in China as well, along with Professor Xi and others. I think it's really a strong advance for China to have a national emissions trading system for its power sector. I think we expect over time, and it just sort of was open for business this year, the first year. I think over time we look forward to that expanding to other industries, other sectors, as the government has said, and also to strengthen it over time, which is just what we saw in Europe, for example, which has an emissions trading system as well. Over time, Europe has strengthened that system so that it really drives emissions down more effectively. I think we'll see the same in China. In the US, we're playing catch up in a way. We are advancing at the state level. Washington State, actually over the weekend, Washington State on the West Coast of the US just became the latest state to put a cap and trade program in place, and only the second state to do it by legislation. So there are advances at the state level in the US, but what we really need in the US is a national emissions trading or national carbon pricing system of some sort. It could be a carbon tax as well. I think that's an uphill political fight, but there may be ways to start laying the groundwork for it even in the next year or two.
Right. I'm actually, Nate, before I let you switch to the other questions, I'm actually very interested in the grid infrastructure building, because that's really essential for all the electricity generated from new energy to transfer nationally. How is the progress in terms of those grid facility being constructed in the US? And how much gap that you still have before you can reach your carbon neutrality goal?
Well, it's interesting. Different models say different things about how much transmission is, and we're really talking long distance transmission. The US, of course, has a very robust and modern grid in terms of local and regional transmission. But if we want to do what the professor and I were talking about, which is take solar power from, let's say, sunny places in the US Southwest to population centers in California or the Midwest, or do the same with wind power in the plains, we'll need those longer distance transmission lines. What's interesting in the US, it's not a question of money, and it's not even really a question of it's certainly not a question of technology. It's actually an issue about coordinating among the different states. And what we need is for the federal government, in this case, to have a little bit more authority to build those long distance transmission lines when they cross states, even if they cross some states that don't benefit from the transmission line. And so it's that kind of federal interstate cooperation that's going to be needed to, in a sense, lay the groundwork or lay the rights of way for those long distance transmission lines. As I said, there are lots of models that say the US can meet its goals without doing that kind of long distance transmission construction, but it certainly would help. And I think it would help promote the sort of wind and solar power we were talking about before.
Right. So thank you, Nate. Professor Xu, it's the same situation in China when we try to transmit any solar generated power to transfer all these power in Xinjiang to the innerland China. So do you think China is ready for this kind of transmission?
China has pretty good infrastructure.
Right.
And currently the goal is to make it more intelligent.
Right.
And using all these AI technology to coordinate the market, coordinate demand from supply.
Right.
I think it's another like trillion level
Right.
investment. Yeah. So,
What
but
is
I
the
think
efficiency rate right now? So how much electricity will be lost during the transmission process in terms of solar power? Do you have a figure?
I don't.
Nate, do you have a figure?
No, I think it's quite, if you build high voltage
Right.
DC current lines, I mean, right, it depends on the technology, but one thing we're looking at are these DC lines rather than alternating current, and they're even over quite long distances, the efficiency loss is quite low, but of
Right.
course it takes the kind of investment that Professor Xi is talking about.
Sure. Erfei, one of the other important technologies is actually carbon capture, as well as carbon storage. So from your observation on the market, do we have enough innovation on these two fronts? And do you see any huge gap between China and the US or between developed and developing countries?
I don't know. This is not the subject that I've
Right. So
studied a lot.
right. So carbon capture and carbon storage, Professor Xu, what's your take on that?
We participated in a project studying the potential of CCUS.
Right.
And in short, and it seemed to be still in China is still too early to
Infant
say.
stage.
Yeah, to say it will be a feasible
Right.
alternative. And I think when we talk about carbon neutrality, currently the feasible technology is carbon sink, carbon sequestration from ecosystem,
Right.
not really CCUS. But we should make more investment, R&D.
Right.
CCUS is probably is a alternative.
Right.
In the
So,
pipeline.
right. So Nate, in U.S. market, do you see the carbon capture and storage technology are getting mature?
Well, I think we're still a little ways from mature, but we are starting to see some deployment. And I think it's useful to think about two areas here of two categories of the technology,
Right.
because carbon capture gets used in a bunch of different ways. So one category is power plants,
Right.
where power plants burn fossil fuel, coal, or increasingly natural gas. And then there's a process that captures the carbon in those, or the carbon dioxide that would otherwise be emitted, and buries that underground. So rather than emitting carbon dioxide from fossil fuel combustion. And one of the most sophisticated examples of that is called the Net Power plant in
Right.
Texas. And it appears to be up and running pretty well. And if that technology proves out, which is a technology that burns natural gas to produce electricity, but captures the carbon and stores it underground, that could be a very important technology. I talked earlier about the need for a zero carbon electricity generation that is 24/7, that's always on, not just when the sun shines and the wind blows. And if we could get cost competitive natural gas with carbon capture, that would be a very interesting and important technology. Right. So we're watching that in the US, not mature, but certainly at the level of deployment.
Right.
The other area of carbon
Right.
capture, just briefly, is actually direct air capture from the sky. I want to agree with what Professor Xi said. Right now, the feasible technologies now to capture carbon from the sky, it's ecosystems. The best
Right.
technology we have to take carbon dioxide out of the sky is a tree. But over time, there are some people who think with the right kind of investment, we could develop those technologies at scale in a way that would be still cost competitive. There are three companies around the world that are doing this, including a couple in the US. That will also be important. Again, not right now to deploy, but to invest in the research and development so that we can see whether that technology comes to fruition. Because if it does, and if we were able to pull carbon out of the sky with technology and bury it underground, that could be a very important part of getting the world to carbon neutrality by mid-century.
Right. So when the technology indeed is getting matured, you're ready to share and deploy it to the global society instead of just keeping it to yourself, because it's so critical.
Yes, well, I mean, that will be a discussion for, of course, that's a central discussion to international trade talks and international talks. I do think it will be vital that we find ways to share this technology widely.
Right.
For exactly the reasons you say. But we also need to do that in a way that preserves the incentives to develop those technologies in the first place. So that's another complicated issue. But as you say, it's vital that those technologies have global application.
Right.
Hopefully that does not become a national security issue.
Which is something
Right.
that we would want to avoid to see. Right. So Erfei, to just follow on that topic, what is your view in terms of China leading this green development in the Belt and Road areas?
I think China is already taking the lead.
Right.
I think that I think the government is encouraging all the companies, or private sector and the state-owned companies that invest in the Belt and Road countries to be green. I think it's important.
Right.
I think that's already happening.
It's already happened. So Professor Xu, any points that you think Chinese government can do more to facilitate this green revolution in the Belt and Road area countries?
Yes, first we have to do that.
Right.
And the first phase of BRI is kind of a trial phase, and it's basically private initiatives from business world, lack of government guidance, I think. But recently there has been like a green BRI initiative
Right.
established, led by Ministry of Ecology and Environment,
Right.
joined by many international organizations. I think it's a change
Right.
for good,
Right.
and there has to be integrated government policy for green, low carbon development
Right.
in BRI.
Right. Nate, your take on that?
Well, I agree completely, and that's why I think it was so encouraging to see both in the U.S.-China joint statement from about 10 days ago when John Kerry visited Shanghai and talked with Xie Zhenhua, his counterpart. That joint statement and President Xi's speech both mentioned and referred to, I think the joint statement talked about maximizing investment in the low carbon transition through the BRI, and President Xi talked about promoting efforts at a green BRI. You know, I think for both countries, as I said before, there's a strong economic self-interest for China and for the United States in promoting green infrastructure, green development, green technologies, because that's an opportunity for growth for their own sectors. I will say the world is clearly moving towards low carbon, net zero. That's the direction of travel.
Right.
And so I think the way to maintain the economic competitiveness of any economy is to make sure that it's leading on green energy and clean energy. That's what we talk a lot about in the U.S. I think that's motivating President Biden in terms of his ambitious goal. And I think the same applies for China as it thinks about the green BRI. So really using that to build up green and low carbon industry in China, I think would be very smart. But again, I see that from the U.S. perspective, we're saying the same thing here. This is an opportunity to promote both green investment abroad and economic growth at home.
You know, hopefully, I think that's very well said. Hopefully, after this program, the Belt and Road Initiative will be viewed more positively
Exactly.
in the United States. This is promoting, fighting
Global environment
the global
change.
environmental change, fighting climate change, and this is actually good for the world.
Right. That's what I about to say as well. Nate, what do you think?
Well, I mean, I think that would be a terrific outcome. I do think it will require, as Professor Xi said, it will require government policies to do that, right? Just as in the United States, it will require government policies and to make sure that more of the investment that we're promoting that climate finance around the world. So I think it will take policies to make sure that that investment is maximized, to use the word of the joint statement, maximized in the low carbon transition, and that really means shifting away from investment in fossil fuel and coal-fired power plants. I think the time where we can invest and build massive amounts of coal-fired power plants around the world is long past. I think Korea pledged last week to stop financing coal-fired power plants, and so I think that needs to be the direction of travel. And I guess the point about the green BRI is there's so much economic opportunity there in terms of investing in that low carbon transition, investing in a green BRI, that it makes, I think, a huge amount of sense economically, as well as being potentially very important for the world.
Right. Great. So, gentlemen, thank you very much. Achieving carbon neutrality will definitely be a difficult task, and today's dialogue showed. And scientists have said this will be the decisive decade for every one of us. And so it's time that we make decisions that will avoid the worst consequences of a climate crisis. Developing countries like China, even though its per capita emission will never reach the same amount as the U.S. on a cumulative basis, has made a decisive move already, and it made its commitment. So global cooperation is needed to achieve this common goal, to make our world a more eco-friendly and for a better tomorrow. So thank you very much, everyone, for watching today's live show. I'm Kate Kui from Beijing. Thank you.